the ancient city of Prague, where the Vltava murmurs secrets older than the stones, the clock stopped. At precisely 3:33 in the morning of All Souls' Day, 1936, every timepiece in the narrow workshop of Master Karel Wawrka ceased its heartbeat. The great astronomical clock he had spent 7 years restoring, the one men whispered was touched by the hands of Rabbi Lowe's golem itself, froze with its skeletal figure of death forever raising its hourglass. And in the centre of that silent mausoleum of gears and pendulums sat Karel Wawrka, throat opened ear to ear, eyes wide in eternal astonishment, while the blood upon the floor arranged itself, by some trick of the lamplight, into the perfect shape of a six-pointed star. They say in Prague that when the clocks stop, someone has betrayed the city. Hercule Poirot, however, does not believe in curses. He believes in murderers. Chapter 1. The Silence at 3:33. The fog lay thick upon the Charles Bridge, as the express from Ostend finally shuddered into Prague's Wilson Station on the 2nd of November, 1936, 2 days after All Souls, and 1 day after the city had awakened to discover that time itself had been murdered. Captain Arthur Hastings, pressed against the window like an eager schoolboy, exclaimed at the forest of spires rising through the mist, black against a pearl-grey sky, as though a wizard had spilled a box of Gothic needles across the horizon. Hercule Poirot, wrapped in his enormous astrakhan coat and nursing the indignity of a slightly deranged moustache after 12 hours of railway soot, merely permitted himself the smallest of sniffs. Wizards, mon cher Hastings. Non, clockmakers. Prague is a city that measures its soul by minutes, rather than heartbeats, and someone, I suspect, has stolen a great many minutes from a certain Monsieur Karel Wawrka. Inspector Jan Novak was waiting on the platform, a tall figure carved from melancholy and cigarette smoke. His coat collar was turned up against a wind that carried the scent of coal and the river, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent the night preventing newspapers from printing the word golem on their front pages. He greeted Poirot with a handshake that was firm but brief, as though formality itself might be contagious. Monsieur Poirot, your reputation has travelled faster than your train. The Minister of the Interior himself begs your assistance. The newspapers scream of curses, of the old Jewish sorcerer, of vengeance from beyond the grave. Prague is a city that loves its legends, but it loves its tourists more, and tourists do not come to be frightened by clay monsters. Poirot's green eyes gleamed like those of a well-fed cat. Lead me, Inspector, to the place where the clocks have died. They took a black Tatra through streets still half medieval, past the astronomical clock on the Old Town Hall, where wooden apostles continued their eternal parade for an audience that now glanced nervously upward, as though expecting Death himself to step out of the mechanism and demand a victim. The workshop lay in a crooked lane behind the square, above a shop whose faded sign read, in gold bohemian lettering, Wawrka and Sin, Horologerie od roku 1789. A small knot of onlookers lingered despite the early hour, kept at bay by two uniformed officers who looked as though they would have preferred to be anywhere else on earth. The inspector dismissed them with a flick of his gloved hand and led the way up a narrow wooden staircase that creaked like an old man's knees. Even before they reached the door, the smell announced itself. Machine oil, polished brass, and beneath it something sweeter and more metallic. The unmistakable perfume of fresh blood, allowed to congeal in a cold room. Inspector Novak produced a key, but Poirot laid a restraining hand upon his wrist. Un moment, s'il vous plaît. One must always approach the scene of a crime, as one approaches a lady of quality, with respect with delicacy, and above all, without disturbing the arrangement of her jewellery. He knelt, examined the lock, the hinges, the slight scuff marks on the painted floorboards, where countless boots had turned in the same spot over centuries. Only then did he nod, and the door swung inward on well-oiled hinges that made no sound at all. Inside, time had not merely stopped, it had been assassinated. The workshop was larger than the narrow facade suggested, a long room lit by tall windows filmed with Prague soot. Every surface crawled with clocks. Pocket watches hung from silk threads like dead spiders. Mantel clocks marched in dusty regiments along shelves. Grandfather clocks loomed in the corners, their pendulums frozen mid-swing. Tiny travelling clocks, carriage clocks, cuckoo clocks, skeleton clocks, clocks with moons and planets and ships that rocked forever on brass oceans. All of them silent, all of them arrested at the same instant, their hands pointing accusingly at 3:33. In the centre of this mausoleum of arrested moments towered the great astronomical clock itself, 7 feet of blackened iron and gilded dials. Its face a riot of zodiacal symbols and Hebraic letters. Its skeletal death forever raising an hourglass that would never turn again. And beneath it, seated at the workbench, as though merely resting between adjustments, was the body. Karel Veverka had been a tall man, thin as a heron, with the long, delicate fingers of his craft. Now those fingers lay palm upward on the green baize, the right hand still holding a tiny pair of tweezers, as though surprised in the very act of creation. His head had fallen back, exposing a throat opened so cleanly that for a moment it looked like a red silk cravat carelessly tied. The blood had poured down the front of his leather apron and pooled upon the floor, where, by some trick of the lamplight, it seemed to form the perfect outline of a 6-pointed star. His eyes, pale blue and slightly protuberant, stared upward at the frozen dials with an expression less of fear than of profound astonishment, as though he had just discovered an error in the universe itself. Hastings made a small choking sound and turned away. Poirot, however, advanced with the calm of a man entering his own drawing-room. He circled the body slowly, hands clasped behind his back, humming a little tune under his breath. "Observe, Hastings," he said at last, "the elegance of the thing. One stroke, from left to right, delivered with considerable force, yet absolute precision. The assassin was taller than the victim, or the victim was seated lower than he believed. And see how the body has been posed, the hands open in supplication, the head thrown back to display the wound. This is not mere murder, mon ami. This is theatre. Murder as grand opera." Inspector Novak cleared his throat. "The door was locked from the inside. The key remains in the lock on this side. The windows are bolted with iron bars no thicker than a finger, yet set so close even a child could not pass. The chimney is narrow and choked with soot. The fire has not been lit in years. No footprints in the blood except the victim's own, and those end at the bench. At 3:33, every clock in the room stopped simultaneously. The patrolman on the beat heard nothing, saw nothing. The daughter discovered the body at 7:30 when she brought her father's morning coffee. Poirot knelt, heedless of the blood that threatened his patent leather shoes, and examined the wound more closely. "A razor, I think, or a very sharp scalpel. The edges are clean, no hesitation marks. Death would have been instantaneous. Yet the expression suggests the victim saw his killer at the final moment. Curious." He rose and surveyed the room again, his gaze travelling over the hundreds of silent faces, And all these clocks, they did not stop because their mainsprings ran down naturally. No. They were released at the same instant by a single mechanism. Someone wished us to believe in a miracle or in a curse. He moved to the great astronomical clock and ran his fingers lightly over the iron frame. This is the famous Prague Orloy's lost twin, yes? The one commissioned by Emperor Rudolph II from the workshop of Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel himself. They say the Maharal breathed life into clay with letters written upon its brow, and that he encoded the secret of that life into this mechanism. When the clock strikes 13 under certain stars, the golem will walk again. Superstition, of course. Yet superstition can be a most useful cloak for murder. Hastings found his voice at last. But Poirot, the locked room, the stopped clocks, the blood forming a Star of David, it's positively ghoulish. You don't suppose there really is something in this golem nonsense? Poirot turned, and for a moment the little detective's face was grave. I suppose only that men will commit murder, for many reasons, Hastings. For love, for money, for hatred, for fear. And sometimes for the sheer pleasure of watching the world believe in magic when the truth is merely mechanical. Come, we have much to see before the little grey cells can begin their work. He paused at the door and looked back once more at the silent room, at the dead man bathed in the cold light of a Prague morning, at the hundreds of clocks that would never tick again, unless someone chose to grant them mercy. Somewhere in the distance, the real astronomical clock on the Old Town Hall began to chime the quarter hour, and the sound floated across the rooftops like a memory of time before it learned to lie. "Regardez bien, mes amis," said Hercule Poirot softly. "Here, in this room, someone has committed the perfect crime. But perfection, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder, and Hercule Poirot has very keen eyes indeed." Then he stepped out onto the landing, and the door closed behind him with the gentle finality of a coffin lid. Below, in the narrow lane, the fog pressed close, and somewhere a single clock began to strike the hour it had forgotten it was supposed to keep silent about. 1, 2, 3, and then, abruptly, it too fell still, as though ashamed of its betrayal. In the workshop of Karel Verwerker, the silence at 3:33 remained unbroken. Chapter 2. The daughter who heard nothing. Eliška Verwerkova received them in the darkened drawing-room above the shop, a chamber that smelled of beeswax, old velvet, and the particular bitterness of grief worn like perfume. Heavy brocade curtains shut out the pale November light, so that the only illumination came from a single lamp with a fringed silk shade and the red eye of the stove in the corner. She sat very straight upon a sofa of horsehair that had known better centuries, dressed already in mourning so deep it seemed to drink what little light there was. 25 years old, perhaps 26, yet she carried herself with the composure of a woman twice her age, who has long ago decided the world will disappoint her, and resolved never to show surprise again. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was drawn severely back, revealing a forehead of alabaster and cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper. Only her eyes betrayed her. The colour of the Vltava in winter, grey-green and cold, and at this moment red-rimmed, though perfectly dry. Poirot removed his hat and bowed with the exquisite courtesy he reserved for beautiful women who interested him professionally. Hastings, predictably, stood rooted just inside the door, as though someone had nailed his boots to the parquet. Inspector Novak remained standing also, hat in hand, his face arranged in the carefully neutral expression policemen adopt when they are about to ask a daughter questions about her father's severed throat. "Mademoiselle Verwerkova," Poirot began in French so pure it might have been distilled on the banks of the Seine, Accept, I beg you, the expression of my most profound sympathy. To lose a father is always painful. To lose him in such circumstances, intolerable." Eliška inclined her head the precise fraction courtesy demanded, and nothing more. "You are kind, Monsieur Poirot. The inspector tells me you are the cleverest detective in Europe. I hope you are also the quickest. Prague is a small city for gossip, and gossip grows teeth very rapidly." Her voice was low, husky, the French flawless, but carrying beneath it the soft Slavic roll that made certain consonants linger like smoke. She wore a small enamelled watch on a black ribbon at her throat. Its hands, Poirot noted immediately, stood at 3:33. Either she had not thought to wind it since the murder, or she had very deliberately chosen not to. "You discovered the body at what hour precisely?" Poirot asked. "At 7:30. I brought Papa his coffee, as I have done every morning since I was 12 years old. The door was locked. I knocked. There was no reply. I used my own key." She said it flatly, as though reciting a lesson learned long ago, yet her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the watch. "And during the night you heard nothing? No cry, no fall, no sound of struggle?" "The clocks, monsieur. You have seen how many there are. When you live above 1,000 ticking hearts, you learn to sleep through almost anything." She allowed herself the ghost of a smile. "Even, it seems, through murder." Poirot's eyes flicked to the watch again. "That is a pretty piece. A gift from your father." "It was my mother's. She died when I was 7. Papa said time was the only thing he could never repair, so he gave me hers to keep." For the first time something crossed her face that might have been pain, but it was gone before it could be named. Hastings cleared his throat, anxious to play his part. Your father had no enemies, I suppose. A man doesn't restore a clock rumoured to be cursed without making, well, inconveniences." Eliška turned the full force of those Winter River eyes upon him. And Hastings felt, as he later confided to his diary, rather like a small beetle pinned to cork. "Everyone who ever asked Papa to sell the astronomical clock became an inconvenience," she said. "Occultists who believed it held the secret of eternal life. Collectors who believed it belonged in museums or private vaults. One German gentleman who offered 1,000,000 Reichsmarks and threatened to take it anyway when Papa refused. My father was stubborn. He believed some things should stay in Prague." She paused, and the silence stretched until it was almost painful. He was wrong. Poirot strolled to the window and drew back the curtain a finger's breadth. Grey light fell across the carpet like spilled milk. "Tell me, mademoiselle, when did you last wind the great clock yourself?" The question hung in the air. Eliška's hand rose involuntarily to the enamelled watch. "I never touched it after the restoration was complete. Papa forbade anyone to go near it. He said it had to find its own rhythm again, the way a sick heart must learn to beat without help. Yet someone wound it very precisely indeed," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. "Wound it, set it, and arranged for every other clock in the workshop to receive the same fatal instruction at the same fatal moment. A single hand released 1,000 pendulums. Your hand, perhaps?" For the first time colour rose in Eliška's cheeks. 2 spots of anger or fear. "You accuse me in my father's house, while his blood is barely dry." "I accuse no one yet," Poirot replied mildly. "I merely observe that the daughter who hears nothing, who finds the body so conveniently, who inherits the workshop, the clock, and whatever price the German gentleman is still willing to pay, such a daughter interests me greatly." Elishka rose in one fluid movement, black silk whispering like a conspiracy. "Then be interested elsewhere, monsieur. I have a father to bury, and a city to keep from tearing itself apart over old stories about clay monsters. Good day." At the door she paused, hand on the porcelain knob, and spoke without turning. "When you have finished measuring the world with your little grey cells, Monsieur Poirot, perhaps you will tell me why every clock in that room stopped at the exact minute I was born. My mother died at 3:33 in the morning. Papa never let me forget it. Perhaps the curse was never for him at all." Then she was gone, the door closing with a softness that felt more final than any slam. In the stillness that followed, the stove cracked like a gunshot, and somewhere far below in the shop, a single clock that had escaped the massacre began to chime the half-hour it had been holding in its brass throat for 2 entire days. It chimed 11 times, then gave a small apologetic cough and fell silent again, as though remembering its manners. Poirot stood motionless, staring at the spot where Elishka had been. "She is magnificent, Hastings," he said at last. "Magnificent and dangerous, like a stiletto wrapped in black velvet." Hastings found his voice. "You don't seriously think she—" "I think," Poirot interrupted, "that in this house time has always been a weapon, and the daughter who heard nothing may have heard everything." He tapped the face of his own pocket-watch thoughtfully. "Come, we have an apprentice to frighten and an occultist to charm, and somewhere in Prague a clock is waiting for the next stroke that will make 3:33 come again." Chapter 3. The Apprentice's Secret. Václav Moravec worked in the narrow back room that had once been a storeroom for spare movements and broken dreams. A place so thick with the smell of metal filings and heated oil that even the November cold could not reach it. He was bent over a gutted regulator clock, sleeves rolled high, revealing forearms corded, with the kind of muscle that comes from wrestling pendulums and mainsprings into submission. 28 years old, perhaps 30, with the fair hair and sullen mouth that Prague gives its angry young men, he did not look up when Poirot, Hastings and Inspector Novak crowded into the doorway. The only acknowledgement was a slight tightening of his shoulders, as though the air itself had become heavier. "So," he said at last, voice flat, "the great Hercule Poirot comes to accuse the poor apprentice. They always accuse the apprentice first. It saves thinking." Poirot stepped forward, unoffended, hands clasped behind his back like a benevolent schoolmaster. "Accusations, mon jeune ami, are for policemen and newspapers. I prefer questions. You may answer them or not, but silence also speaks, and I have excellent ears." Václav laid down the tiny screwdriver with exaggerated care, and finally met Poirot's gaze. His eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky just before snow, and at this moment they held a fury so pure it was almost beautiful. "Ask then. I have nothing to hide except the fact that I am glad the old bastard is dead." The words dropped into the room like a hammer on brass. Inspector Novak stiffened, but Poirot only raised an eyebrow a millimetre. "Glad? That is strong, even for an apprentice who has been dismissed." "I was not dismissed," Václav spat. "I was discarded, like a worn escapement. 7 years I gave him, 7 years of nights without sleep, of fingers bled raw on wheel teeth, of learning every secret he pretended was sacred. And for what? So he could laugh when I asked for his daughter's hand. 'You smell of oil, boy. Elishka will marry silk and passports, not grease and calluses.' Those were his exact words." Hastings shifted uncomfortably. He had never been able to bear raw emotion. It embarrassed him the way nudity embarrasses the English. Poirot, however, leaned forward, scenting blood in the conversational water. "You loved Mademoiselle Eliska?" "Love?" Václav repeated, tasting the word as though it were spoiled wine. "Yes, I loved her when she was 17 and used to sneak down here to watch me work. I loved her when she kissed me behind the astronomical clock and tasted of coffee and secrets. I loved her the night the old man found us and beat me with a length of pendulum rod until I could not stand. And I still loved her yesterday, when she looked through me as though I were made of glass." He turned away suddenly and busied himself with a tray of pinions, but not before Poirot saw the glint of moisture that was not machine oil. "He took my key to the workshop last month," Václav continued, voice muffled, "said I had become careless. I could take that clock apart and reassemble it blindfolded. But he was afraid I would help Eliska sell it to the German. Afraid of everything except his own reflection." Poirot picked up a tiny escape wheel and turned it between finger and thumb. "And on the night of the murder, where was the discarded apprentice?" "In my room above the bakery in Malastrana, pacing, drinking slivovitz, trying to decide whether to kill myself or kill him. In the end, I did neither. Old Mrs. Svobodova heard me walking until dawn. She will tell you." "Convenient," murmured Poirot. "And yet you have oil on your cuffs that smells of the same mixture the master used linseed and whale. Very particular. Fresh oil, not a week old." Václav's hand shot out and knocked the tray from the bench. Pinions scattered across the floor like metallic hail. "Because I came here yesterday after the police left. I wanted to see him dead with my own eyes. I stood over the body and I laughed. Is that what you want to hear, little Belgian? That I laughed while his blood was still warm?" Inspector Novak moved forward, but Poirot lifted a hand. "No, non, Inspector. Passion is not proof, though passion leaves fingerprints where none should be." He bent and retrieved something from the chaos on the floor, a single length of waxed cord, cut cleanly at both ends. This, I think, once held a pendulum. The pendulum that was found severed beside the body. Curious that it should be here, in your room. Václav stared at the cord as though it were a snake. I found it on the stairs this morning. I meant to throw it away. Or to keep it as a souvenir, Poirot suggested gently. The apprentice who knows every secret of the workshop. Who could, perhaps, rig a mechanism to release 1,000 pendulums at the same instant. Who hated the master enough to make his death a spectacle. Václav's laugh was ugly. If I had killed him, I would not have needed tricks. I would have looked him in the eye and used the same knife he once held to my throat when I dropped a balance wheel. He rolled up his left sleeve without being asked. A jagged white scar ran from wrist to elbow, livid against the pale skin. His parting gift when I dared speak of marriage. Ask Eliska. She bandaged it. She cried, and then she went back upstairs and never spoke my name again. Silence settled, thick and uncomfortable. Somewhere in the walls, a rat scratched behind the wainscot, sounding uncannily like a clock trying to remember how to tick. Poirot slipped the length of cord into his pocket with the air of a conjurer palming a coin. "You are a dangerous young man, Monsieur Moravec," he said quietly. "Dangerous because you believe yourself powerless. Powerless men, when they finally strike hard. Remember that." As they turned to leave, Václav called after them, voice cracking. Tell Eliska that the clocks will never start again, not while I breathe. I will break every one of them with my bare hands before I let her sell a single gear to that Nazi bastard." On the stairs, Poirot paused and looked back. The apprentice stood framed in the doorway, light behind him. A silhouette carved from rage and grief. "Touchy fellow," Hastings muttered when they reached the street. "Touchy," Poirot agreed, "and terrified. But terror and guilt wear the same face at a distance, mon ami. And somewhere in this city, a clock is waiting to strike 3:33 for the second time. When it does, I think our passionate apprentice will either save us all, or hang for it." He glanced up at the windows of the apartment above. For a moment, a pale oval appeared behind the curtain Eliska watching, or perhaps only the reflection of a cloud. Then it was gone, and the fog closed in again, swallowing even the sound of their footsteps. Chapter 4. The woman who bought midnight, Ludmila Dzihova, lived in a narrow violet-painted villa on the slopes of Vinohrady, where the trams no longer dared to climb, and the street lamps gave up halfway, as though light itself feared to trespass. The house had once belonged to an alchemist who vanished in 1897. The neighbours still claimed that on certain nights the chimneys exhaled not smoke, but starlight. When the door opened, a breath of warm incense rolled out myrrh, benzoin, something darker underneath. And there she stood framed in candle glow, like a woman stepping out of a painting no decent gallery would ever hang. She was perhaps 50, perhaps 500. Time had treated her the way a jealous lover treats a rival, beautifully, cruelly, incompletely. Her hair, black threaded with silver, fell unbound to her waist. Her gown was violet velvet, heavy with jet beads that clicked softly when she moved. At her throat hung a silver pentagram the size of a man's palm, and her eyes were the colour of absinthe seen through smoke. "Monsieur Poirot," she said in French that carried the faint rustle of old Prague gutters. "At last the man who measures the world with logic comes to the woman who measures it with longing. Enter freely and of your own will." She stepped aside, and the three men crossed the threshold into a hallway where every surface crawled with occult bric-a-brac. Astrolabes that tracked planets no astronomer recognized, hourglasses filled with black sand that refused to fall, a human skull wearing a crown of dried roses. The air tasted metallic, like the moment before lightning. Hastings clutched his hat as though it might protect him from witchcraft. Inspector Novak looked faintly ill. Poirot, delighted, inhaled as though entering a patisserie. "Madame Dzihova," Poirot began, bowing over her hand which was warm and smelled of crushed herbs. One does not often meet a woman who buys midnight by the hour. Ludmila laughed, low and rich, and led them into a drawing-room lit solely by black candles in silver sconces. The flames burned perfectly upright, unmoved by any draught. In the centre of the room stood a table draped in indigo silk. Upon it lay a single photograph in a frame of human finger bones. Carol Veverka, younger, smiling, arm around, a dark-haired woman who could only be Ludmila 30 years before. "You wish to know about the clock," she said, gesturing them to seats that looked carved from midnight itself. "Everyone wishes to know about the clock. Carol promised me it would strike 13 when the stars were right. 13 for the hidden sphere, the veil between worlds. On All Souls' Night, the veil is thinnest at 3:33. He swore the mechanism would tear it wide enough for one soul to step through. My soul, if I paid the price." "And the price?" Poirot asked softly. "Gold, of course, and something rarer, a promise that when I crossed over, I would bring him with me. He wanted eternity, little detective. He wanted to escape the slow death of being merely human." Her fingers caressed the photograph. Instead, he betrayed me. 3 weeks ago, he wrote that the work was finished, then refused to deliver. Said the clock had spoken to him in dreams and warned him against opening doors that were meant to stay shut. Poirot leaned forward. You threatened him. I reminded him, she corrected. There are older contracts than those written on paper. I gave him until All Souls to honour his word. He chose silence, then he chose death. Hastings found his voice. You're saying you killed him with magic? Ludmila's smile would have frozen brandy. I do not kill, Captain Hastings. I arrange. Sometimes death wears a silk glove, sometimes a razor, sometimes it simply stops the clocks and lets the appointed hour find its own way in. She rose and crossed to a cabinet of black wood. From a drawer she withdrew a bundle wrapped in crimson silk. Unrolling it revealed a single brass gear, large as a saucer, etched with Hebrew letters that seemed to writhe when glanced at sideways. This was to have been the heart of the 13th stroke. Karl removed it the night he decided to betray me. I felt it leave the mechanism the way one feels a tooth pulled. Poirot took the gear with reverent fingers. And yet every clock stopped at 3:33. Someone completed the mechanism after all. Someone, Ludmila echoed. Or something. The city is older than its stones, monsieur. There are veins beneath the streets where the golem still sleeps. When blood falls in the right pattern, she glanced meaningfully toward the invisible workshop. The clay remembers its purpose. Inspector Novak made a small, strangled sound. Poirot merely turned the gear beneath the candlelight and watched the letters dance. Tell me, madame, he said conversationally, were you and Maître Veverka ever lovers? The question struck like a thrown knife. For the first time, Ludmila's composure flickered. The candle flames dipped as though bowing. Once, she whispered, when I was young, and he was beautiful, and we both believed time could be seduced. He promised me forever then, too. Men who repair clocks are dangerous, Monsieur Poirot. They come to believe they can repair everything else. Hearts, oaths, the fabric of the world. She replaced the gear in its silk and closed the drawer with a soft click like a jaw snapping shut. Find who killed him if you must, she said, suddenly weary. But understand this, the clock wanted blood. It always has. Karl thought he could cheat it by refusing to finish the work. Instead, he fed it his own throat. As they rose to leave, a tall grandfather clock in the hallway, its face painted with the moon's dark side, began to chime. Once, twice, 13 times. The notes were wrong, sour, as though the metal itself were screaming. Hastings went white to the lips. Coincidence, he declared stoutly when they reached the street. Poirot looked back at the violet house, where black candles still burned behind curtained windows. Coincidence, Hastings? Or choreography? Someone in this city is conducting a very elaborate symphony, and the next movement, I fear, will be played in blood again. High above them, on the hill of Visegrad, the real stars wheeled indifferently, waiting for 3:33 to come around once more. Chapter 5. The German Offer. Otto von Krantz occupied the entire imperial suite on the top floor of the Hotel Imperial. A gilded cage overlooking the river and the castle, as though the Habsburgs themselves had only just stepped out for a cigarette. The door was opened by a manservant whose face had been trained to reveal nothing, not even the fact that it had once been broken and reset badly. He took their coats with the silent efficiency of a priest receiving offerings, and ushered them into a drawing-room that smelled of Havana tobacco, Machtpolitik, and very expensive fear. Von Krantz rose from a leather armchair, the colour of fresh blood. He was tall, blond, 40 perhaps, with the kind of face that looks carved from alpine ice, and then polished by generations of certainty that the world belonged to him by right. The monocle in his left eye caught the chandelier light and threw it back like a challenge. "Ah, de berühmte Monsieur Poirot! And Captain Hastings, the hero of many cricket fields, I believe. And the good inspector, please, gentlemen, sit. May I offer cognac, kümmel, something to warm the democratic bones on this Slavic morning?" His French was perfect. His smile was perfect. The dueling scar on his cheek was perfectly placed to suggest both aristocracy and violence. Everything about Otto von Krantz announced that he was a man who collected beautiful things. Ming porcelain, Renaissance bronzes, Sudetenland real estate, and if the price was right, other people's countries. Poirot declined the cognac with a small, regretful gesture. "We come, Herr von Krantz, on a matter less pleasant than brandy. You wish to purchase the astronomical clock of Maitre Karel Verwerker. You offered 1,000,000 Reichsmarks. He refused. 2 nights later, he was dead in a locked room, surrounded by stopped clocks. You will forgive us if we find. The timing. Suggestive," von Krantz laughed, a sound like champagne opened by a sabre. "Suggestive? How deliciously Belgian. My dear Poirot, I offered 2,000,000. In gold?" Verwerker spat on the cheque. "Literally." The old Jew thought his toy was some sacred relic that belonged to Prague, to Bohemia, to the ghosts of dead rabbis. I tried to explain that history belongs to those strong enough to take it. He preferred melodrama. He crossed to a lacquered cabinet and withdrew a folder thick with correspondence, each letter embossed with the Verwerker crest. Read. Every refusal more theatrical than the last. The final one arrived the day before he died. He wrote that the clock had begun to speak at night, warning him that if it left Prague, the golem would walk again and crush the thief beneath clay feet. Superstitious peasant nonsense. I replied that the Reich is not afraid of fairy tales. Poirot leafed through the letters with delicate distaste, as though handling something contagious. And when reason failed, Herr von Krantz, did you perhaps turn to pressure? The German's smile did not waver, but something moved behind the monocle, like a shark fin. Pressure is such an ugly word. Let us say incentive. There are men in this city who understand that the future belongs to the strong. Some of them owed Verwerker money. Some of them owed me favors. Debts have a way of rearranging priorities. Inspector Novak leant forward, voice rough. You were seen in the old town on the night of the murder. At the Black Ox Tavern. At 3:15 precisely. Wearing astrakhan. Asking for absinthe and directions to Siletna Lane. For the first time the smile faltered. Impossible, yet the barman is prepared to swear to it. He remembers the German accent and the scar. He remembers you paid with 100 koruna note and told him to keep the change because soon Czech money would be only good for lighting fires. Von Krantz recovered instantly, spreading manicured hands. Then arrest me, gentlemen. With what evidence? That I drank absinthe in a city that drowns in the stuff? That I walked the streets like any tourist? You have nothing but the word of a Bohemian drunk against that of a Reich citizen. Poirot's voice was silk over steel. We have the glove, mon vieux. Black leather, left hand found this morning in the Vltava mud beneath the Charles Bridge. Monogrammed OVK inside the cuff, and on the little finger very faint, but my friend at the police laboratory is a wizard with luminol traces of the same whale and linseed oil, used only in the Verwerker workshop. Curious, for a man who claims never to have entered the room. The monocle dropped, swinging on its black ribbon like a tiny gallows. Von Krantz caught it smoothly. A plant? communist agitators, Jews. You cannot trust anything in this mongrel city." "Perhaps," Poirot said amiably. "Or perhaps a careless man dropped a glove while arranging for a stubborn clockmaker to have his throat opened at the precise moment every pendulum in Prague received its fatal instruction. Tell me, Herr von Krantz, do you believe in curses?" The German's laugh was shorter this time, almost a bark. "I believe in ownership. Then you will understand when I say that Hercule Poirot now owns a considerable interest in your immediate future." Poirot rose, buttoning his coat. "We will speak again when the clocks decide to strike a second time. I think you will find 3:33 comes very quickly when one is waiting for it." At the door he paused. "One last thing. Mademoiselle Eliška Veverkova, you have met her, I believe? She stands to inherit everything now. A beautiful woman, a valuable clock, and no inconvenient father. Such coincidences must delight a practical man." Von Kranz's face could have been carved from the same ice as his ancestors. "Careful, little Belgian. Some doors, once opened, do not close again." In the corridor outside, Hastings mopped his brow. "Insufferable bounder! I'd give anything to see him in the dock." Inspector Novak's smile was thin. "In Czechoslovakia, Captain, even bounders have embassies." They were waiting for the lift when it happened swift, almost elegant. A man in the uniform of a hotel porter rounded the corner carrying a silver tray with a single glass of Kümmel. As he passed Poirot, he stumbled, the tray tilted, and the glass shattered against the wall. In the instant of confusion, the porter's hand flashed not a glass shard, but bright steel. Poirot twisted, too late. The blade would have taken him in the ribs, had Hastings not flung himself forward like a rugby forward tackling an invisible opponent. The two men crashed to the carpet, the knife skittering away beneath a console table. The porter sprang up, but Novak was faster. Steel cuffs snapped shut. The man said nothing, only stared at von Kranz's door with the blank expression of a soldier who has failed an order. Von Krantz appeared in the doorway, genuinely startled. "Gott im Himmel! In my own suite!" "Indeed," said Poirot, straightening his tie with trembling fingers that betrayed nothing. "A most enthusiastic welcome, Herr von Krantz. I look forward to returning it." As they descended in the lift, the cage rattling like bones, Hastings was pale. "He tried to have you killed, in broad daylight." "Non, mon ami," Poirot corrected gently. "He tried to have me warned. The next time, I think, will not be so polite." Far below, the river slid past the hotel windows, grey and indifferent, carrying the reflection of a city that had seen knives before and would see them again. Somewhere in the distance, a clock began to strike the quarter, then thought better of it, and fell silent, as though the hour itself had taken fright. Chapter 6. The Second Death. At precisely 3:33, on the morning of the 4th of November, the clocks began again. It was not a gentle resumption, not the hesitant tick of a single escapement remembering its duty. It was a thunderous, simultaneous assault. Every clock in the Veverka workshop, every silent sentinel that had stood frozen since the murder, exploded into life at the same instant, as though a single invisible hand had wound every mainspring to its snapping point, and then released them in one savage chorus. The sound rolled through the old house like artillery, rattled the windows of Soletan Lane, and brought half the neighbourhood into the street in nightshirts and terror. Poirot, who had taken a room 2 streets away precisely to be within earshot, was already dressed. He stood at his window in coat and muffler, eyes glittering in the darkness. Hastings, bleary and indignant at being dragged from sleep, joined him just as the great astronomical clock in the workshop gave tongue not its usual stately chime, but a cracked, discordant clamour that sounded disturbingly like a scream. "They're all going!" Hastings gasped. "Every blessed one! Does this mean the curse is broken, or fulfilled?" Poirot finished grimly. "Come, mon ami, the second act begins." They reached the lane in time to see Inspector Novak's men battering down the workshop door, which someone had locked again from the inside. When it gave way, the scene inside was lit by a single oil lamp swinging wildly from a hook, casting shadows that capered like devils. The clocks were in full voice now, hundreds of ticks overlapping into a metallic roar. And in the centre of the storm hung Václav Moravec. He had been strung up from the iron frame of the astronomical clock itself, a thick hemp rope knotted beneath his left ear. His boots dangled 6 inches above the bench, where Karl Vaverka had died. His face was purple, eyes protruding, tongue black and swollen, yet there was something almost peaceful in the way his arms hung at his sides, as though death had come as a relief rather than a shock. Around his neck, on a placard painted in careful block letters, were the words, "I killed him for love of Eliska. Forgive me, Václav." The clocks chose that moment to fall silent again, every pendulum halting mid-swing, so that the only sound was the slow creak of rope and the soft drip of something onto the floorboards. Inspector Novak swore in Czech, a single violent word that needed no translation. Hastings turned away, retching. Poirot advanced through the frozen avenues of timepieces until he stood directly beneath the body. He studied it for a long minute, then reached up and touched the dead man's boots. "Still warm," he murmured. "He has been dead less than an hour. Yet the knots are old sailors' work, the rope cut from the very cordage used to hoist the astronomical clock into place 20 years ago. Curious." He moved to the placard, produced his lens, examined the paint still tacky, the lettering perfectly even, no tremor, the slight slope to the left that only a right-handed man forces when trying to disguise his natural hand. And this confession is written by someone who wished us to believe Václav Moravec incapable of writing upright under stress. Yet he was left-handed. Observe the scar on his wrist, he would have written, with the paper turned 90 degrees. A small thing, but murderers who stage suicide so elaborately often forget the small things. Novak barked orders. Photographers' bulbs flashed like summer lightning. Eliska Viverkova appeared at the head of the stairs in a black dressing gown, hair loose, face drained of every drop of blood. She stared at the hanging man for a long moment, then pressed both hands to her mouth, as though to cage a scream that never came. "He left a letter," she whispered, "on my pillow. He said he could not live, knowing Papa's death was his fault, that he had loosened the mechanism in jealousy, that the clock starting again was a sign he must follow. I thought it was grief. I burned it." Poirot turned, eyes suddenly sharp as broken glass. "You burned it, mademoiselle? How very convenient for the murderer." Eliska's gaze did not waver. "Believe what you must, Monsieur Poirot. I have buried a father, and now the man who loved me. Prague is very good at burying its children." She descended the stairs slowly, passing beneath Václav's slowly turning body without looking up, and disappeared into the shadows of the shop. The scent of her perfumed jasmine and morning lingered like an accusation. Later, in the cold grey of dawn, Poirot stood alone in the workshop while constables cut the body down. He examined the rope, the beam, the precise placement of the bench beneath, so that Václav's boots had left 2 perfect crescents of Malá Strana mud on the green baize. mud still wet. Mud that could only have come from the closed and guarded Jewish cemetery on the other side of the river. Someone, Poirot said softly to the empty air, walked a dead man across Prague tonight. Someone who knew the patrols, who had keys to ancient gates, who persuaded poor Václav to come quietly to his own execution. And someone who wished the world to believe the case closed with a convenient suicide. He looked up at the great astronomical clock, now silent again, its skeletal death frozen forever in the act of raising an hourglass that would never run out. 2 deaths at 3:33, he murmured. 2 locked rooms, 2 confessions. Non, mes amis, this is not a tragedy in 2 acts. It is a conjurer's trick look here while the real crime happens there. And Hercule Poirot does not enjoy being made to look the fool. Outside, the city was waking to headlines that screamed of cursed clocks and doomed love. Inside, the little Belgian touched the fresh rope burns on Václav Moravec's neck and felt, for the first time since arriving in Prague, the cold breath of real fear. Because somewhere in the maze of streets, a murderer was laughing, certain that the perfect crime had now been committed twice, and that the 3rd act, when it came, would be the final one. And somewhere, very faintly, beneath the floorboards of the workshop, something that had no right to move gave a single, patient tick. Chapter 7. The Twin Beneath the Floor. The discovery came at dusk on the 5th of November, when the light in the workshop had thinned to the colour of old blood, and the constables had begun to speak in whispers, as though the clocks might overhear them. Poirot had dismissed everyone save Inspector Novak and Hastings. Even the photographers had been sent away. He stood in the exact centre of the room, beneath the great astronomical clock, eyes half closed, turning slowly like a man listening to music only he could hear. "Regardez," he said at last, voice soft. "The floorboards here are newer than the rest. See how the grain is straighter, the nails brighter. And observe the dust. It lies thick everywhere except along this precise line, as though a trapdoor has been opened and closed many times when no one watched." He knelt, coat pooling around him like spilled ink, and ran his penknife along the seam. A section 2 meters square lifted with surprising ease, revealing a set of narrow wooden stairs descending into darkness that smelled of damp earth, candle smoke, and something sweeter, the unmistakable sweetness of long-contained human decay. Hastings recoiled. "Good God, Poirot, what fresh horror is this?" Poirot was already descending, lamp raised. "Come, mon ami. The house of Veverka has kept one more secret than even the daughter suspected." The cellar was small, low-ceilinged, lined with shelves of forgotten movements and broken dials. In the centre, chained to an iron ring bolted into the stone, sat what had once been a man. He wore the ragged remnants of a Great War uniform, the tunic still bearing faded corporal stripes, and the name Veverka, worked in thread now grey with age. The body had mummified rather than rotted. The Prague air is dry beneath the streets, and the chains had held him upright even in death. His skull had fallen forward, thin grey hair hanging like cobwebs. But the face, dear God, the face was Karel Veverka's own, only younger, thinner, marked by years of madness and captivity. On the floor lay a tray with the remnants of a meal no more than a week old. Black bread, a rind of sausage, a tin cup overturned. Someone had fed this living corpse until very recently. Poirot's lamp trembled, the only sign that even he had not expected quite such abomination. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, "a twin, identical. The brother everyone believed killed at Zborov in 1917. Instead imprisoned beneath his own house for 20 years, fed like a dog, hidden like a shame. Hastings was shaking. But why? In heaven's name, why? Poirot moved closer, examining the chains new links added regularly, the older ones filed through and replaced, because Karel Veverka discovered, perhaps during the war, perhaps after, that his brother Jan carried the seeds of madness. Violent madness. There were stories, I think attacks on women in the Yosefov, bodies found with throats torn rather than cut. Karel, the respectable master clockmaker, could not bear the scandal. So he brought his twin home, told the world he had died a hero, and kept him here, beneath the floorboards, where the ticking of 1,000 clocks would drown any scream. He pointed to the walls, where crude charcoal drawings covered every inch, hundreds of clocks, all showing 3:33, and in the centre of each face a crude 6-pointed star. The mad brother obsessed over time, over punishment, over betrayal of the city perhaps. And Karel indulged him, fed him, even allowed him small freedoms within the cellar until the day the twin escaped. Poirot's voice dropped. That day was All Souls' Night. The brother climbed the stairs while Karel worked late on the astronomical clock. There was a struggle. Karel killed him one clean stroke, the same stroke we saw upstairs. Then, in panic or genius, Karel staged everything, posed the body of his twin as himself, arranged the stopped clocks, locked the door from the inside, using a thread and a falling weight, an old clockmaker's trick, and escaped through the cellar, planning to return later as the miraculously resurrected master, beyond all suspicion. Inspector Novak had gone the colour of tallow. Then the man we buried yesterday. Was Jan Veverka, the mad twin? Karel is still alive, somewhere in Prague, laughing at us. Poirot bent and lifted something from the floor beside the corpse. A gold pocket watch, its case engraved to my brother Jan, on his 60th birthday. The hand stood at 3:33. The watch had stopped years ago, but fresh fingerprints Karel's own still gleamed on the crystal. But someone discovered the truth, Poirot continued, voice now terrible in its quietness. Someone realized that the dead man was not Karel at all, and that someone used Karel's own perfect mechanism, the hidden wires, the falling weight, the razor-thin garrotta that descended at the fatal hour to cut the throat of the wrong Veverka, when he returned to the workshop to complete his deception. He looked up at the underside of the floorboards above their heads. Observe the groove cut here and here. The wire passed through the bench itself. Karel built the perfect locked-room murder for his brother. He simply did not expect to sit in the chair himself. Hastings was swaying. Then Václav's suicide was murder, staged to close the case. The apprentice had begun to suspect he had seen the twin once, years ago, glimpsed through a crack in the floor. Someone silenced him before he could speak. Poirot climbed the stairs slowly, as though each step added a year to his age. In the workshop, he stood beneath the astronomical clock and addressed the empty air. "Bravo, mon assassin! You turned the clockmaker's own weapon against him. You made the curse come true with a length of piano wire and beautiful timing. But you forgot one thing. Hercule Poirot does not believe in curses. He believes in murderers who grow careless when they think the play is over." He turned to Novak. "Find Karel Veverka. He cannot have gone far. He will want to watch. And bring Mademoiselle Eliska again. I think the daughter knew more of her father's cellar than she has admitted. And perhaps the German paid for 2 murders instead of 1. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft and silent, covering Prague in a white shroud. Beneath the workshop floor, the chained twin sat in his endless 3:33, waiting for a brother who would never return. And somewhere in the city, a living man looked at his watch and smiled, believing that time finally was on his side. He was wrong. Chapter 8. The Mechanism of Murder. At midnight on the 6th of November, the workshop was lit only by a single green-shaded lamp, and the cold white glare of the snow pressing against the windows. The clocks remained silent, frozen at 3:33 like soldiers awaiting a command that would never come. They had been gathered into the centre of the room in a wide circle, hundreds of them, so that the great astronomical clock now stood on a small island of brass and mahogany, its iron frame throwing long skeletal shadows across the floorboards. They were all present. Eliška, black silk dress buttoned to the throat, face pale and perfect as a death mask. Otto von Krantz, monocle glittering like a predator's eye. Ludmila Zihova in her violet cloak, silver pentagram rising and falling with each slow breath. Inspector Novak flanked by two silent officers. Hastings trying not to look at the trapdoor that still gaped like an open grave. Poirot stood beneath the astronomical clock itself, small and immaculate, hands clasped behind his back, moustaches fierce with purpose. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, voice ringing clear in the hush, "we have been invited to believe in a curse. A 400-year-old legend that when the clocks of Prague stop at 3:33, the golem awakens and punishes betrayal. 2 men have died, 1 mad, 1 murderer, both at the appointed hour, both in this locked room. The newspapers are satisfied, the police are embarrassed. Only Hercule Poirot is not satisfied, because curses do not leave fingerprints. And these deaths were arranged by human hands, clever, greedy, cruel, human hands." He turned slowly, letting his gaze rest on each face in turn. "Let us begin with the truth the floorboards concealed. Karel Wawrka had an identical twin, Jan, believed killed in the war. In reality, Karel kept him chained beneath this house for 20 years, feeding the madness he feared would destroy the family name. On All Souls' night, the mad twin escaped. Karel killed him 1 stroke, here at this bench, then staged the perfect impossible crime. He posed the corpse as himself, stopped every clock by a single hidden trigger, locked the door from the inside with thread and falling weight, and fled through the cellar, planning to return later as the miraculously surviving master. A resurrection worthy of Lazarus." Von Krantz gave a soft laugh. "Fairy tales, Monsieur Poirot. Even for Prague, this is rich. Patience, Herr von Krantz. The fairy tale becomes richer. Someone discovered the substitution, someone who had been watching the house very closely. That someone realized that if the real Karel could be lured back to complete his deception, the very mechanism he had built to kill his brother could be turned against him. And so, 2 nights ago, Karel returned. He sat at this bench to reset the master trigger. At 3:33 the weight fell, the wire descended, and the clockmaker who believed he could cheat time had his throat cut by his own perfect machine." Eliška's voice was a whisper of silk. "You are saying my father killed his own brother, then was killed in turn by whom? By the person who stood to gain everything," Poirot answered gently. "The workshop, the priceless clock, the freedom to sell to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder was standing in this room wearing astrakhan and a monocle." Von Krantz took 1 step back. The 2 officers moved to block the door. "But first," Poirot continued, "a distraction was needed. Poor Václav Moravec had begun to remember glimpses of the twin beneath the floor. He had to be silenced. So, on the night the clocks restarted a signal, you understand, that Karel was dead, Václav was drugged, taken to the Jewish cemetery for the mud on his boots, brought here, and hanged with a forged confession. a suicide that conveniently closed the case. Ludmila Zhihova spoke for the first time, voice low. And the golem? The blood star? The 13th chime? Atmosphere, madame. Beautiful theatre. The blood formed a 6-pointed star because the bench is placed exactly beneath the zodiac disc. When the throat is cut, the blood runs along grooves Carol himself carved for drainage of cleaning fluid. As for the 13th chime in your hallway child's play, for a clockmaker's daughter who studied her father's craft. Poirot reached up and pressed a small iron stud concealed in the frame of the astronomical clock. From the base descended, with the soft whisper of silk, a hair-thin wire weighted by a lead cylinder no longer than a finger. At its tip gleamed a fragment of razor blade, bright as a smile. "Behold the curse," Poirot said. "A simple counterweight released when every pendulum reaches the same fatal arc. Carol built it to kill his brother silently. You, mademoiselle, used it to kill your father when he returned to claim his own resurrection." Elishka did not flinch. "Prove it." Poirot produced from his pocket a single black silk glove, the mate to the one found in the river. "Found this morning in your bedroom, behind the lining of a hatbox. Left hand, because the wire must be guided from behind the victim's chair. And on the cuff, see? Fibers of astrakhan exactly matching Herr von Kranz's coat. You stood together in this room 2 nights ago, lovers and conspirators, while the clock you both coveted did your killing for you." Von Kranz lunged for the door. Novak's men were ready. Elishka remained perfectly still, only her eyes alive, winter rivers breaking their ice. "You knew everything," she said wonderingly. "The twin, the cellar, the wire. How?" Poirot's smile was almost sad. "Because the perfect crime is never perfect, mademoiselle. It leaves the fingerprint of pride. You wished the world to believe in magic when the truth was merely mechanical. And because he touched the frozen hands of the astronomical clock, no clockmaker, however clever, would ever allow his greatest work to remain stopped forever. The real Carol would have restarted them the moment he returned. Only someone who did not love the clocks, someone who saw them only as a means to millions, would leave them dead." Snow tapped at the windows like impatient fingers. Elishka looked once at von Kranz, now struggling between 2 officers, and something like contempt passed across her face. "I would have given Prague eternity," she said softly. "Instead, I sold it for German gold." Inspector Novak snapped cuffs onto her wrists. She did not resist. As they led her past the circle of silent clocks, she paused beneath the astronomical clock and laid her cheek for a moment against the cold iron, as though saying goodbye to a lover. Poirot watched her go, then reached up and gently wound the great mechanism. Somewhere in the walls, a spring uncoiled with a sigh of release. One by one, the pendulums began to swing, the ticks overlapping into the familiar heartbeat of time restored. "Et voilà," he murmured. "The curse is broken. There was never a golem. Only a daughter who wanted more than her father would give her, and a city old enough to forgive almost anything except betrayal." Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering the footprints of murderers and policemen alike, and Prague, ancient and patient, settled back into the small hours, waiting for the next secret to ripen in its stones. Chapter 9. The Last Tick. Snow still fell in slow, deliberate flakes when they led Elishka Veverkova and Otto von Kranz down the narrow staircase for the last time, past the shop window, where the faded gold lettering now looked like an epitaph. She walked without hurry, head high, the black silk of her dress brushing the banisters with a whisper that might have been regret or merely satisfaction that the play had ended on her cue. Von Krantz struggled, face crimson, monocle long lost, cursing in 2 languages. The cuffs had bitten red crescents into his wrists. Neither prisoner looked at the other again. Inspector Novak paused on the landing to light a cigarette with shaking fingers. "They will hang, both of them," he said, more to himself than to Poirot. "In this country we still know how to punish those who sell their fathers for foreign gold." Poirot stood beneath the astronomical clock, listening to the new, steady heartbeat of the workshop, hundreds of clocks now ticking in perfect synchrony, as though ashamed of their earlier silence. "Hanging is quick, mon ami," he answered softly. "Living with what they have done will be slower." Ludmila Ziova had remained behind, violet cloak drawn close, eyes fixed on the mechanism that had promised her eternity and delivered only ordinary murder. She approached the clock now, laid one gloved hand against the cold iron, and spoke without turning. "You have broken a miracle, little Belgian. That wire was meant to open the veil, not close a throat." Carol understood once. Then he grew afraid of wonder. Poirot regarded her with something close to pity. "Wonder is dangerous, madame, when it is purchased with another man's life. The veil you wished to tear was woven of human greed, nothing more. There was never a golem waiting beyond it, only a daughter who learned too well how to wind a mainspring to its breaking point." Ludmila's smile was thin and ancient. "Prague forgives everything except clarity. You have given the city clarity tonight. It will hate you for it." She drew the silver pentagram from her throat and laid it on the bench where 2 men had died. "Keep this. When you are old and the little grey cells grow tired, you may yet knock on a door that opens only at 3:33. She swept past him, cloak brushing the ticking clocks like a farewell caress, and disappeared into the snow without looking back. Hastings cleared his throat. "Rum woman. Half believes her own nonsense. I shouldn't wonder." "More than half," Poirot said. "Belief is the most dangerous drug in Prague. It makes people willing to wait centuries for a clay giant that never comes, or to kill their own fathers for a German cheque." He moved among the clocks, pausing now and then to correct a pendulum's arc, to wipe a fingerprint from a crystal, small acts of restitution. When he reached the astronomical clock, he opened the lower panel and revealed the hidden groove where the fatal wire had run. With a pair of tweezers, he extracted the last fragment of razor blade, still flecked with dried blood, and dropped it into an evidence envelope. "Regardez, Hastings. The perfect crime, beautiful, symmetrical, proud. Elishka allowed her father to kill the mad twin and stage the curse." She waited. She watched. When Karl returned to claim his resurrection, she and von Krantz stood behind him in the darkness, guiding the wire with a gloved hand so that it kissed the throat exactly as planned. Then they restarted the clocks to signal success, hanged poor Václav to close the inquiry, and prepared to sell the greatest treasure of Prague to the highest bidder. Love, patriotism, mysticism all sacrificed to the oldest god of all, money. Hastings shivered, and the blood forming the Star of David. Grooves in the bench for oil drainage. The city did the rest, saw what it wished to see. Prague is generous with omens when it wants to believe in monsters instead of men. The front door opened, letting in a gust of snow and the flash of newspaper cameras. Reporters shouted questions in 3 languages. Novak's men pushed them back. Somewhere a church bell began to strike one, then thought better of it. The sound died mid-peal, as though even the bells had learned caution. Eliska paused on the threshold. For the first time her composure cracked. She looked back at Poirot, and her eyes were no longer winter rivers but a child suddenly frightened, suddenly small. "Tell me one thing, monsieur," she said, voice barely audible above the ticking. "When you wind a clock, do you ever think of the spring inside, how much pressure it can bear before it snaps?" Poirot met her gaze without flinching. "Every day, mademoiselle. That is why I try never to wind human beings too tightly." She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, then stepped into the waiting police van. Von Krantz followed. Silent now, the arrogance bled out of him. The doors closed. The van pulled away through the snow, tires crunching like breaking bones. In the sudden quiet, the clocks seemed louder, almost triumphant. Poirot stood alone beneath the great astronomical clock and watched the apostles begin their slow parade as the mechanism settled into its rightful rhythm. Somewhere inside the works, a gear that had waited 400 years clicked into its final position, and Death raised his hourglass one deliberate inch higher. Hastings joined him, scarf wound to the eyes. "It's over then. Back to England, thank God. Though I'll miss the beer." Poirot did not answer at once. He was listening to the city, the soft hush of snow on ancient roofs, the distant lament of a tram, the patient heartbeat of 1,000 clocks that had decided to forgive Prague one more night. "It is never over, mon ami," he said at last. "Somewhere a daughter is learning that fathers can be sold. Somewhere a collector is measuring a country's soul by the thickness of its gold. And somewhere beneath these streets a real monster of clay still sleeps, dreaming of the day when the clocks stop again." He closed the panel gently, as one might close a coffin. "But tonight we have given time back to the living. Come, there is Slivovitz at the hotel, and tomorrow the Orient Express waits. Prague will keep its secrets a little longer." Together they stepped out into the falling snow. Behind them the workshop door swung shut. The lamp was extinguished, and the astronomical clock struck one solitary chime. Clear, pure, unafraid, before settling into the quiet ticking. That is the only prayer old cities ever truly trust. The curse was broken. The city exhaled and slept. Chapter 10. Epilogue. The Little Grey Cells. The Ambassador Hotel bar was almost empty at 11:30, the hour when Prague begins to believe that tomorrow might arrive after all. A single violinist soared gently at a Strauss waltz no one had ordered. And the waiter, a melancholy veteran of too many empires, kept refilling their glasses without being asked. Hastings nursed a Slivovitz the colour of pale fire. Poirot, faithful to his principles, sipped a crème de menthe that glowed like a small green planet. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the city muffled and luminous. Every dome and spire softened into something that might almost be forgiven. From their table by the window, they could see the Vltava sliding past, black and patient, carrying the reflections of 1,000 street lamps toward the sea. Hastings raised his glass. "To the cleverest brain in Europe, present company very much included." Poirot permitted himself a modest bow. "And to the most loyal friend a detective could wish. Without your rugby tackle in the Imperial corridor, mon cher, this brain would now be decorating a carpet." Hastings flushed with pleasure and embarrassment in equal measure. "All the same, Poirot, I shall be jolly glad to see the White Cliffs again. Prague is a beautiful city, no denying it, but it gives one the feeling that the walls are listening. And the clocks, well, I shan't be sorry never to hear 3:33 again." Poirot turned his glass slowly, watching the green liqueur catch the light. "You think it is finished, then?" the daughter in her cell, the German on his way to whatever justice Czechoslovakia still possesses, the clocks ticking sweetly once more. Order restored, n'est-ce pas? Isn't it? Hastings asked, suddenly uncertain. Poirot's gaze drifted to the window, where snow had begun to slide from a rooftop in a soft white avalanche. Order? Yes, but truth. Truth is more difficult. Eliška Veverkova will hang or spend her life in Mlada Boleslav prison, and the city will call it justice. Yet consider, she was 25 years old, raised above a workshop where every tick reminded her that her mother died at 3:33, where her father kept a living brother chained like a beast, where love was punished with scars and marriage offers dismissed with laughter. She sold a clock, Hastings. She did not sell her soul. It had already been taken in installments. Hastings shifted uncomfortably. Still murdered her own father. Indeed. And murdered poor Václav, and would have murdered the legend of Prague itself for 2 million Reichsmarks. I do not excuse, mon ami. I merely understand. The little grey cells are not merciful, but they are just. The violinist began The Blue Danube, slower than usual, almost a lullaby. Somewhere in the distance, the real astronomical clock on the old town hall struck the quarter, clear across the snow-laden roofs. Poirot lifted his glass to the night, to all the daughters who wind the spring too tight, to all the fathers who believe they can lock madness in a cellar and throw away the key, to all the cities that teach their children that time can be cheated if one is only clever enough. He drank, then set the glass down with finality. And to the golem, who never woke, because the real monsters were made of flesh after all. Hastings stared into his Slivovitz. Do you suppose there ever was a real golem? Poirot smiled, the small cat-like smile that always made Hastings nervous. Ask the river, mon ami. The Vltava has been here since Rabbi Loeb walked these streets, and rivers remember everything. Perhaps one night, when the clocks stop again and the blood forms another star on ancient floorboards, the clay will remember too, but not tonight. He rose, buttoning the astrakhan coat that had survived tram attacks, knife-wielding porters, and Prague itself. Come, the Orient Express leaves at 8. London is waiting, and there is, I believe, a new pudding at my favourite restaurant that demands investigation. They stepped out into the hotel courtyard. The snow was deep and untouched. Their footprints were the first to break its perfect surface. Above them, the castle loomed, windows glowing like watchful eyes. And somewhere high on the hill, the statues of saints kept their silent vigil over a city that had buried another secret beneath another layer of white. As they reached the street, a single clock very distant, very pure, began to chime midnight. 1, 2, 3. It continued, unhurried, unafraid, until the 12th stroke faded into the waiting hush. Hastings exhaled a cloud of breath that hung like a small ghost. Funny, I could have sworn it was going to stop at 3:33. Poirot looked back once at the Golden City. Spires and bridges softened into a dream that might almost be innocent. Non, Hastings, he said softly. Tonight Prague has decided to let time run its course. Tomorrow, he shrugged, the smallest, most Gallic movement imaginable tomorrow is another century's problem. He offered his arm, and together they walked toward the station where the train waited, steam curling into the cold like the breath of something ancient and merciful that had chosen, for one more night, to remain asleep. Behind them, in the workshop above Shaletna Lane, the great astronomical clock ticked on, steady and serene, its apostles parading for no audience at all. And if, in the deepest hour before dawn, a faint additional sound, neither tick nor tock, more like the patient heartbeat of River Clay, remembering its name rose from somewhere far beneath the streets. No one was there to hear it. Prague, after all, is very good at keeping its own counsel. And Hercule Poirot, moustaches impeccable, little grey cells quietly triumphant, boarded the Orient Express with the satisfied air of a man who has reminded a city that even the oldest curses can sometimes be broken by nothing more mysterious than the truth. The train pulled out exactly on time, whistles sounding across the snow, carrying 2 Englishmen home to a country where clocks, for the most part, only stop when they are broken. In the empty workshop, the astronomical clock struck one final private note soft, almost tender, before settling back into the ordinary miracle of seconds adding themselves to minutes, minutes to hours, hours to years. Time, forgiven at last, moved on.